Well, as I said, my name is Guadalupe Quinn. What I'm going to talk about, I mean, I'm not an immigration attorney, and I'm not even a college grad, but I have been working in the community and for a long, long time. And what I want to do is just take the opportunity to share with you what I know of what has happened with families in our community, and also what has happened here in Lane County. So one of the things that I want to mention is, although we don't have raids all the time, there was a couple of really awful raids that happened in our community. One happened in April of '97, one happened in March of '98, and then in May of '98. And it was probably, the May raid was probably the largest and the worst raid that I believe we've had here in Lane County ever. And so one of the things that happened after those sort of raids that were close by is we as a community of folks that were trying to deal with the aftermath of the raid and dealing with families and what was happening with their children and just the mess that had been created by those raids, got together and we wrote a report called Lomita Raid Report. And basically what we did is we ended up documenting what had happened in those raids and ended up talking about, this particular report was just done by a bunch of us in the community, but it included the impact that it had on the families, the impact that it had on our children, the impact that it had on the schools, the amount of money that it cost ICE to come in and raid these businesses in our community. And we also ended up writing up all of the things that we were told by the families that ICE did that we know was against their policies. They were absolutely awful in how they treated our community. And so one of the things that we did is we documented it in this report, and we used the information, one, to go back to ICE and to let them know what they had done and what their policy said. We actually had a meeting with them in our community, which included some of our political representatives and people from the community, to say, you know, your policies say you're not supposed to do this, and yet here's what we're hearing from families of what you did, you know, detaining them, handcuffing them, having them chained, not allowing them to go to the bathroom, not feeding them, dragging them on a bus from one area to the other, detaining them overnight, keeping them on the floor, not allowing the women to go to the bathroom by themselves. It just was a huge miss at what happened. And so just so that you know, it isn't something, I think other than this, the only thing that we know happens is there are, you know, as Raquel had mentioned, there are people who go to your house. There are people that are picked up, and ICE goes and looks for folks, whether it's the Lane County Jail or whether it's going to people's homes based on some report or some warrant or something. We know that there is some activity, but to the level of what had happened in this report, we have not seen. Other than that, what I know has happened here in Oregon is that really awful raid in Portland in 2007 at the Del Monte plant. And so part of it is just so that you know, even a few years after this took place, and even though we ended up having to respond by figuring out what do we do with the families, how do we find their children, how do we notify the schools, you know, where is everybody? It took years for families and children to even begin to bounce back, because they were totally traumatized, not only by the separation, but by what had happened when children were coming home and nobody was there, and they couldn't figure out where their parents were, or child care providers were left with children for days because they didn't know what was happening because of these raids. So it's really important to know that, you know, the impact that it has on children and families, I think affects them almost a lifetime. I can't imagine being as young as some of these kids are. And I'm sure that maybe some of you probably, because of your studies, don't know if you've seen this particular report from the National Council on La Raza that talks about, this is called The Impact of Immigration Raids on American Children. And this is just the summary, it's like 100 and something, but I mean, this is all I understand. You know, I think there's work to be done by our legal system and by our attorneys and our advocates, and that's really, really important. But I'm not an attorney, and I don't work in a system where I need to like really know what do you do? How do you respond through the legal system? What I know is what happens with the children. If you look at the face of this little girl, what happens to them as human beings? That has nothing to do with me understanding the law, but me trying to figure out as a community person, as a community advocate, what do we do? What are the resources? How do we check back with these families? How do we make sure that we begin to reassure them, you know, that they're going to be okay? How do we let the community know that their schools are going to be emptied for a while because these folks are so scared to let their children out of the house? Or the retail stores who don't see anybody anymore because people are in hiding. And often in our community, even though I have not seen, and there has not been a big raid, I get a lot of calls from folks in our community who are hearing, and there's rumors often about ICE being in our community, and it becomes huge. I mean, it becomes huge. If one person hears something, true or not, or whether it's a rumor control, it becomes, you know, work for me for a couple of weeks. And that happened not that long ago where, you know, I spent 10 days cruising Walmart and Winco and Costco and all these stores, you know, at different times throughout the day, trying to figure out, was ICE really around? Because people were calling and saying, you know, they're there, they're in the parking lot, they're waiting for us. I heard they picked up so-and-so. And so part of what came out of this particular response to the ICE raid in 97 and 98 is Migra response team, which we reactivated here in our community in 2007 after we heard about the raid in Del Monte in Portland. And Amigos Migra response team is made up of different components. We have a response team that includes a phone tree, which are individuals in our community who are willing to go out no matter what time it is to figure out what's going on if we hear about a raid. We have legal observers that have been trained to help us document or, you know, interview folks if we need to, either during or after the raid. We have a group of mostly bilingual, bicultural counselors who are part of our crisis team, who we hope, you know, are the folks who are going to help us with our families, with the children, with the families, to get some counseling, you know, after the trauma of that kind of a raid. And then we also have a family center here, thanks to a really wonderful pastor who is very active in the community around human rights, named Dan Bryant, whose church is our sort of facility in case we need to do something about it. And so part of it for me in sharing that with you is just to let you know that, you know, we are always prepared, or trying to always be prepared in case something happens. And part of that is all the stuff that we learned from these raids back in 97 and 98, and how much work it takes for folks to really be able to bounce back. And so what we see, as we saw back then and even today, what I see with families and children when they hear about rumors about ICE being here, or those families, is, you know, on a daily basis, what I see in our community with our families and our children is that they're afraid. They're really, really afraid. They're not ever really sure. I talk to a lot of the families when I visit the schools when they have family nights, and the thing that really scares them is that they really do worry every day that they're going to leave to go to work, and they're not really sure that they're going to come home. And that's not only the adult parent worry, that's also the child's worry. We hear from kids who are really nervous. They're very attached to the parent because they're so worried that if the parent leaves, are they going to be there to pick them up after school? Are they going to be there to pick them up at the child care center? You know, what happens? And so that is something that I see is something that's a daily thing for these families. And it creates an enormous amount of stress, not just for the adults, but also for the children. And then also, I think most of them are paying attention to what's going on in the news. The anti-immigrant sentiment in this country has gotten worse in the last 5 years than I've ever seen it in my whole life of living here. I am more afraid of being an immigrant in this country right now than I ever was in probably the first 40 some odd years I was here. It feels really, really scary. And that is something that our families are aware of. That is something that the parents are aware of. They worry about their children and what's going to happen to them. And unfortunately, we have not had anything happen that relates to anything looking at the reform that needs to happen. You know, we see an increase on raids. We see an increase on money being thrown at the border. We hear about stuff like Arizona, which only makes people really, really scared, where they're more profiling our community. There's programs that are being developed by the government and supported even by this administration that creates a system where you can almost track anybody. Even if they were on the moon, they would find you, it seems like. And so people are really, really frightened about what is going on and feel even more nervous about getting out and about doing anything. And part of it for us as immigrant rights advocates who want immigration reform at the federal level, I mean, that's our constant push. Because until we have immigration laws that work and until we look at, you know, what to do with the individuals that are here and have been here for a long time, contributing to this country in an enormous amount of ways, until we look at that, you know, we're always going to be sort of dealing with, you know, the kinds of stuff that happens with ICE having more money and more resources, the walls being built on the border, places like Arizona who have created a law that now puts a lot of fear in folks. And just so that you know, even though the law might be in Arizona, our communities here in Oregon are really, really nervous. They're not ever sure if it means just there or if everywhere. And so people become really, really nervous. We also know that when our representatives are back in session this coming year, there is going to be a proposed law that's similar to the Arizona law here in Oregon. So we're going to need to really, really fight that. So part of it for me is looking at, you know, what's happening to our families and our kids, dealing with racism, dealing with feeling profiled, looking at the anti-immigrant movement that's become loud and proud in our community across the country, and also really trying to move forward comprehensive immigration reform. Well, what I tend to sort of look at, excuse me, is sort of trying to figure out how do we educate our community and how do we educate the broader community? How do we build those alliances? So areas in which we focus on is, one is we know that we need to do more work for our families around having them know their rights. And so we're looking at ways with organizations like the Civil Liberties Defense Center here with Lauren Regan, who's done a series of Know Your Rights trainings in our community in Spanish, and part of that is to continue that. The other thing is to make sure that our Migra response team is always sort of prepared for whatever might happen in our community. The other thing that we put together a couple of years ago was this Preparedness Packet, and part of that is this came out, I think it might have been after, maybe before the raid in Del Monte. But one of the things that the Migra response team did is we created a packet, a preparedness packet for our families that helps them to sort of organize their paperwork and organize themselves in case there might be some kind of a raid. And what we did was put together a packet that's got information, know your rights in English and in Spanish, and resources, as well as we want them to organize their paperwork. So we put some forms in here that allows them to put down the information that we think is really important to have. One of the things that happened in the raids in the late 90s was that people weren't really sure about the names of the schools that their kids were at. We had no idea who were the family members in Mexico, who were the folks that we could talk to here. So part of what we're hoping is that these forms help people to write down who lives in the house, who are the children, what are their ages, what are their schools, the medical stuff, and mainly it's to just help families to organize their stuff and to, you know, to put things away that they get, to make sure they have copies of birth certificates and that kind of stuff that helps them to make sure that someone that they really, really trust has this information that we can use, or they can use in case something happens and the parents are separated or their children are left behind because of a raid. And one of the things that we've done with these packets is we printed about 1,000 and I've given out about 500. And part of that is taking them to the families and making sure that we go through that, so through the packets, so that they know how to use them. And they're aware of the importance of getting their stuff together and making sure they have copies and extra copies of even things that you don't often think about is you know, copies of their car keys, a copy of their house or the place where they're living, and even their mailboxes. What happened in the 98 raid in May is that we went back to the mill where the men were picked up in hopes of retrieving all of their cars, and unfortunately not one family had an extra key for the cars. So we were not able to remove them from the lot, and unfortunately they get towed and the family loses them. So something as simple as that is what we're using these packets to make sure that folks are thinking about things that would be helpful for them as well as for us who are going to try and be there and to support them and to sort of deal with the aftermath of whatever might happen. So that's a couple of things that I just want to share with you. The thing I want to close with, which is something that I think was probably the most impactful for me, and see if I can talk about it without crying because it was so sad, is I remember, and this sort of tells it all, I remember going to a meeting to do a presentation on these packets, but also to talk a little bit about the work that I was doing around comprehensive immigration reform and stuff. And there was a mom, these were mostly moms, and there was a mom who was part of the group who was very, very proudly sharing that this packet was great and that she did not have to worry about it because her 13-year-old had already been prepared to take over the household if anything happened to her. And that she knew everything about what she needed to know to take care of her other 3 brothers and sisters who were little. And she was like a middle schooler, 12 years old or something. And the mom felt really, really proud that she had her daughter prepared. And while she's talking, her middle school daughter is in tears because she's thinking about, she's got the responsibility of taking care of dealing with all of what the adult would do by herself if somebody took her mom. And that to me was, I mean, I sat there and I thought, part of me totally understood how that woman felt so proud. Like, yeah, we're prepared. I'm glad you gave me this, we're prepared. My daughter here is going to take over everything. She knows about the finances, she knows about the rent, she knows about the doctor, she's got 3 brothers and sisters, she knows how to take care of them, she's going to deal with everything. And here's this middle school 12-year-old next to her in tears because she's thinking, and I'm thinking to myself, this little girl must be totally stressed out every single moment of her life she's not with her mom, worrying that at some point she's going to become the adult in that family. And so to me, that's probably the thing I thought, this is what it's like for our children and for our families. And that just sort of left me feeling like, boy, we really need to do a lot more. No 12-year-old should have to live knowing that she's the one who's been left to be responsible for her entire family and her brothers and sisters by herself. If something happens to her mom. And she was also really well briefed and being told she is not to let anybody know at school or anywhere else that she is by herself. She cannot tell anybody she is by herself because her mother told her, if you tell anybody, they will come and get all of you. So she is not about to go tell anybody at school or any other adult that she needs a thing. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I'm freaking out. This young woman's, is proud of her daughter and the little girl is in tears. And I thought to myself, this is so telling. People really need to know this is how awful it is at times and the impact is at this level is just unbelievable. And I don't believe that she is the only young woman in our community or the only kid in our community who's been handed, that sort of responsibility. So, thank you.